There was a guy in the office who always dumped his work on me and then got the bonuses. I started keeping a log of who did what. When it was time to report, I sent it to his boss. Not only did he lose his bonuses, but he was also demoted. For the first time, I felt true satisfaction from justice. My boss humiliated me in front of the whole office, but when I made him pay, the silence that followed was louder than any apology. For 3 years, I was the invisible engine of a small department, the person who fixed the numbers, polished the presentations, and stayed late to salvage other people's deadlines. There was a man, charismatic, loud, carefully casual, who floated through the office like a sailboat and collected rewards that weren't his. He had a gift for taking credit and a knack for blaming others with a smile. I watched him move my work into his inbox, watched him accept praise in meetings that should have been mine. I endured the polite condescension, the jokes that landed as jabs, the small public corrections that cut more deeply than necessary. The turning point was a quarterly review where, in front of the team, he repeated my phrase, presented my spreadsheet, and received a bonus that had my fingerprints all over it. When I asked for clarification, my question was deflected with a chuckle. Later the same day he cornered me in the break room and said, with casual cruelty, "It's just business. Don't be so sensitive." It was the kind of line that leaves you wondering if you're imagining everything, if you're merely thin-skinned or if the world had tilted. The desire for revenge didn't arrive as a roar, it settled in like a slow, steady pressure. I wanted accountability, not catastrophe. I wanted the record to show the truth, not for him to be publicly torn down. I wanted fairness. I began with the meticulous, almost meditative task of documentation. I became a quiet historian of our small injustices. Dates, draft versions, email threads, and the subtle fingerprints of ownership. This was not a movie montage of cloak-and-dagger skullduggery. It was the banal but deadly effective practice of keeping receipts. I saved earlier drafts with their timestamps. I exported change histories. I archived message threads where ideas had been seeded and nurtured by others, and later repackaged as someone else's brilliance. I learned to phrase things for clarity rather than anger. The power of a neutral record is that it can't be branded as spite. I practiced restraint. I collected corroborations from teammates who were tired of watching the same pattern unfold, but I presented their notes as corroborating facts, not as betrayals. Each entry in my journal was a small, patient brick. Soon the foundation of a case emerged. The plan took shape quietly, with a sort of strategic patience that looks boring from the outside but is lethal in its precision. I forged a timeline mapping idea inception to delivery, side-by-side comparisons of documents, and a short memo that narrated the flow of credit. I took care to avoid melodrama or rhetorical flourishes. The weapon I was building was a clear, irrefutable chain of evidence. When the company announced the annual performance reviews and awards, I knew the moment had arrived to stop collecting and start presenting. The packet I assembled was antiseptic in tone: dates, attachments, version histories, and a few witness statements that read like footnotes. No venom, no taunting. Just a paper trail so neat it would be awkward to call it vengeance. I also prepared for the human variables. I practiced my delivery. Calm, measured, unemotional. I anticipated the likely defenses, claims of oversight, misplaced credit, or innocent forgetfulness, and placed counterpoints beside them. I timed the meeting for a Monday, when the week's rhythm had not yet dulled attention. I invited HR under the premise of a routine review, and I made sure the manager in question did not suspect that the day would be anything other than ordinary. Part of the satisfaction was in the ordinariness. The reveal would arrive amid fluorescent lights, coffee steam, and the unremarkable clack of keyboards. I wanted truth to land in the place where untruths had been most comfortable, the everyday. The build-up included subtle signals that primed the room. I shared a preliminary summary report with my supervisor a day before. Something concise, matter-of-fact, that wouldn't ring alarms. I arranged for a colleague who had been quietly compiling their own notes to be present. Everything was domestic and bureaucratic. An email subject line, a meeting entry, a printed packet with a professional binding clip. The plan was surgical, not cathartic. My satisfaction would not come from spectacle but from correction. Crescendo. The review room smelled faintly of stale coffee and citrus cleaner. People arrived with their usual politeness, ready for small talk and quarterly recaps. The man who had grown used to wearing other people's work like an accessory took his place at the table with his practiced grin. The manager greeted us and gestured for me to begin. I opened my laptop and pulled up the first slide. Simple, clear, and unadorned. The first slide showed an initial draft I had circulated months before. The second slide displayed a later file bearing his name with almost identical structure. Each comparison was a small, precise incision, timestamps aligned, phrases repeated verbatim, and email headers that traced a path from origin to appropriation. I spoke in neutral syllables, as if reading a technical report. Each fact landed with the sound of inevitability. The room cooled. The habitual banter that usually filled such meetings evaporated into a hush. I could see the man's face, how he'd perfected a public smile that dissolved under the weight of a timeline. He tried the practiced denial, the flinch and smile maneuver, but the evidence was arranged without gaps. I allowed pauses between slides, calculated silences that let others notice details without me pointing them out. That silence was an instrument. It turned casual onlookers into witnesses. I did not call him a thief. I corrected the record. When the HR representative looked up from the printed packet and asked a factual question, the tone hardened into procedure. That was the other thing I had counted on: institutional repair. Procedures are not dramatic. They are clinical and effective. The charismatic man's responses thinned into evasions, then excuses, then the embarrassed fumbling of someone who has been caught on a flat plane of fact. People in the room shifted their attention from personalities to documents, and the documents did what documents do. They spoke in timestamps and original drafts, and they refused to be argued into oblivion. The highest, most satisfying moment came not as a scream but as a shift in the room's gravity. The manager closed the laptop and, for the first time, spoke without his usual buffer of pleasantness. He asked questions in a voice that had no room for charm. HR requested further documentation and announced a formal review. The charismatic man's confident posture melted into something small and real, an awkwardness that no amount of performance could cover. There was no dramatic public humiliation, no raised voices. Instead, there was the administrative equivalent of a gavel fall. Decisions began to be made in the language of policy: reassignment of credit, revocation of a pending bonus, mandatory training, and a note on file. The consequences were procedural and proportional, which felt, perversely, more satisfying than theatrical fury. It was like watching justice served in daylight rather than vengeance in shadow. The office watched as a habitual inequity was corrected through bland, unavoidable mechanisms. The man who had relied on gloss and swagger watched as his narrative was rewritten by invoices, timestamps, and corroborated emails. His allies, which had been mostly the inertia of habit, offered little resistance when the evidence closed the loop. The most cinematic part of this non-cinematic moment was how ordinary the aftermath looked. HR emails, calendar updates, a quiet reassignment of responsibilities. The satisfaction was not in seeing him destroyed, but in seeing the pattern he had perfected finally snapped by the very mundanity he had exploited. After the storm, the office rearranged itself, familiar but with new sightlines. Credit began to follow deeds, not charm. No confetti, only quiet recalibration. Interactive. So tell me, would you have acted the same way? Why? He thought the storm had passed, but I was only warming up. For a while after HR's quiet intervention, it looked like the universe had righted itself. Daniel, the man who had perfected the art of walking into applause while leaving the mess for someone else, moved through the office with the same practiced grin, but there was a new stiffness to it. A carefulness in his gait, as if he were learning to limbo beneath a bar he used to vault. He smiled more. He volunteered to support others more loudly. He made jokes about teamwork that landed with a thin clink of forced politeness. For 3 weeks the department breathed easier. Whispers of the review faded, drowned by deadlines, coffee runs, and the small storms of everyday work. Then, like a slow leak in an old tire, the pattern crept back. Daniel did not return to his old blunt thefts, the brazen appropriation that had gotten him a revoked bonus, but he found subtler channels, nudging me at 5:58 p.m. with a half-formed slide, switching the subject line of an email so the thread looked like his idea, or assigning me a task in the tone of a favor that I would later do because I could not afford not to. The irritation that had simmered into a plan now hardened into a necessity. Proving had stopped being enough. I wanted to anticipate and prevent. I wanted to teach him, without melodrama, that the terrain of credit and consequence had shifted and that the old shortcuts would no longer work. So I became a strategist. I mapped his moves the way a chess player studies an opponent. Where he liked visibility, where he hated grunt work, how he always gravitated toward brainstorming and away from execution. When the company announced a high-profile client pitch, the kind of project where spectacle could outshine substance and where charisma often trumped craft, I recognized Daniel's orbit immediately. He floated into the kickoff meeting like a seagull into a banquet, wings spread to claim every morsel. He volunteered to be point person before anyone else had the chance to blink. But this time, instead of resisting his claims, I fed them with careful traps. Every minor research task he tossed my way I turned into an artifact. Polished deliverables, time-stamped drafts, and progress emails sent not only to him but also looping in the director and HR with neutral subject lines. I made my contributions visible in a way that could not be shrugged off as posturing. I made them bureaucratically inconvenient to ignore. I cultivated one ally who had also been on the receiving end of Daniel's credit harvesting. A junior analyst with a quiet backbone, and we coordinated our notes in a way that looked accidental to everyone else but was actually a net woven to catch any attempt at misattribution. I learned to give Daniel just enough rope. If he asked for an early draft, I sent him a deliberately skeletal version that would look careless under scrutiny and then separately send the finished product with a subject line like "Final" for director review, which left no ambiguity about origin. It was a petty elegance. Let him parade sloppiness, but make the polished work own the record. The tension built in small, domestic ways. Extra copies of reports saved to shared drives, meticulous version control, casual updates to the director that read like routine professionalism but functioned like flares. I didn't need drama. I needed procedure to do the humiliating work for me. The rehearsal 3 weeks before the client pitch was where everything converged. Daniel arrived with a deck of flashy slides and big phrase charm, the kind of presentation that dazzled but inched dangerously close to empty. He had sketched the outline and left the mortar to others. When the director, trained to spot holes, pointed out weak data sourcing and fragmented narrative, Daniel smiled and offered the usual lines. "This is a snapshot. We'll fill in details," the verbal equivalents of smoke. That was my opening. Calmly, innocuously, I pulled up my own file. A full-sided, visually coherent alternative that directly addressed the director's strategic goals. I had anticipated the areas where he would wing it and filled them in with a kind of thoroughness that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Exact data tables, footnoted sources, and a storyline that marched toward the client's bottom line. I presented it as an alternative for consideration, casual and almost apologetic in tone, because the point was to let the work speak, not to shout. The room changed its posture. Managers leaned forward. The client liaison, who had been fidgeting with expectations, began to nod. Daniel's practiced composure crumbled into small human mistakes. A throat cleared, a glance that broke eye contact, a weak attempt at humor that landed like a pebble in a pond with no ripples. The director, appreciating the clarity and fearing last-minute salvage, quietly decided that my version would form the backbone of the final pitch and asked Daniel to support specific sections instead of leading. No theatrics, no public shaming, just a polite reassignment that cut a vein through his assumed authority. The satisfaction was not the euphoria of watching someone fall. It was the surgical pleasure of seeing a pattern corrected by the mundane instruments of accountability, emails, file timestamps, and managerial preference for clarity over charisma. In the days after the rehearsal, Daniel attempted to reclaim control through charm and low-level sabotage. Missing a meeting that required his input, suggesting a last-minute visual that undermined an entire slide, or offering to host a coffee chat that turned into thinly veiled attempts to rewrite contribution histories. Each move was predictable, and each time I neutralized it with the same tools. Forward copies to leadership, polite public confirmations in email threads, and the quiet accumulation of evidence that made his missteps look like habit rather than isolated lapses. The pitch itself, when it came, was mine to lead. Standing in front of the client, using the slides I had refined and the narrative I had built brick by brick, I felt a calm unlike any triumph I'd imagined in fantasies. The applause afterward was measured and professional, not triumphant, and the client's follow-up email, a dry, businesslike note praising the thoroughness and strategic clarity of the presentation, landed in my inbox with a subject line that matched the administrative language I had used to forge credit. Thanks for leading. Project name, deliverables. Daniel watched from the side, face a study in composed defeat. His options narrowed to support roles and grudging acknowledgement. Management adjusted responsibilities quietly. A formal note on file, a shifted role description, and a suggestion of mentorship that felt more like containment than growth. The office air smelled different after that. Less like gossip and more like calibration. People who had once rolled their eyes at the idea of fairness began to treat documentation with a new respect. Junior staff learned that careful records were not petty armor but practical currency. For me, the victory was not simply that I had reclaimed credit. It was that the system had been nudged toward justice without theatrics, that the mundane mechanics of work, emails, timestamps, version histories, had become the instruments of correction. And yet, even as the department settled, a small, ironic part of me recognized that this was not an end but a precedent I had set for myself. The patient, procedural dismantling of advantage wherever it surfaced. So tell me, if you had the choice between a slow, meticulous takedown that leaves no doubt and a single dramatic blow that everyone remembers, which would you choose? Would you spend months building an immovable paper trail, or would you opt for the spectacle and risk the story being rewritten the next day? He thought losing the spotlight in front of management was the worst that could happen. But he hadn't yet seen what it felt like to be completely outmaneuvered on his own turf. By the time the client pitch had concluded and the dust settled, Daniel was no longer the golden boy of the department. His name had slipped from the top of the performance list, his projects were being co-led instead of championed, and the quiet murmur in the office had shifted. People no longer assumed he was the brain behind every polished report or slide. But here's the thing about people like him. They don't fade gracefully. They linger. They regroup. They search for new angles, smaller cracks to wedge themselves into, because control for them isn't just a perk, it's oxygen. And the more suffocated he felt, the more desperate his moves became. At first, his strategy was subtle. Little attempts at building alliances, fake bonding moments in the break room, carefully worded jokes about how he and I were such a great team. To anyone not paying attention, it might have looked like reconciliation. But I could see through it. Every smile was a reconnaissance mission, every casual chat was a probe for weaknesses. And then he tried something bolder. A new internal project was announced. An innovation task force to design efficiency improvements across the company. It wasn't flashy like the client pitch, but it promised direct visibility with senior leadership and a potential fast track for promotions. Daniel wanted in badly. He lobbied the director for a seat on the team and managed to wrangle one, but the role came with strings. Concrete deliverables, clear deadlines, and measurable impact. No amount of buzzwords would be enough here. This was the kind of project where execution meant survival. I knew what was coming. He would try to siphon ideas from others and repackage them as his own. So, once again, I decided to turn the board upside down. I joined the task force too, not as his rival, but as his silent shadow. I volunteered for the grunt work he thought beneath him. Gathering baseline data, interviewing staff in other departments, analyzing existing processes. He waved me off in meetings, calling my role supportive, but I smiled, knowing each spreadsheet I built was another nail in his coffin. He crafted vague proposals like streamline workflows through digital integration, while I brought forward actual models, projections, cost-benefit analyses, and implementation roadmaps. I made sure every submission carried a date stamp, a clear author tag, and was circulated to the entire team, not just him. Slowly, the contrast began to glow. Daniel's ideas were balloons, colorful but empty. Mine were bricks, solid and unignorable. Then came his boldest move yet. He tried to claim ownership of one of my models. A comprehensive analysis showing how automation in our reporting could save hundreds of hours annually. He copied a section into his own deck, stripped the author tag, and presented it in a subcommittee meeting as if it had sprung fully formed from his imagination. Unfortunately for him, I had anticipated exactly that. The version he copied was a draft I had deliberately seeded into a shared folder, polished enough to look impressive, but incomplete in ways that only the creator would notice. At the meeting, when he presented his solution, I stayed quiet at first, watching the managers nod politely. Then the director asked about a key assumption. This projection says implementation costs will be recouped in 6 months. Can you walk us through how you modeled that figure? Daniel froze. He stammered, bluffed, tried to redirect. I let the silence stretch. Long, heavy, almost theatrical. Then I raised my hand and spoke in the same neutral tone I had perfected. I think the version you're referencing might be the early draft. The finalized model has updated numbers, including a sensitivity analysis. If it helps, I can pull it up right now. And I did. On screen appeared the real file. Polished, airtight, with footnotes and visualizations. The room tilted. Managers compared the two versions, and the difference was glaring. Not just in accuracy but in authorship. The file metadata was right there, with my name, my timestamp, my notes. Daniel looked like a magician whose trick had failed halfway, leaving the rabbit kicking and scratching in plain sight. The climax wasn't a shout or a reprimand. It was the quiet, devastating efficiency of procedure. The director asked HR to clarify attribution processes going forward. A formal report was filed documenting the incident. Daniel was instructed, politely but firmly, to route all future contributions through team leads for verification. In other words, his days of slipping credit past the radar were over. And as the cherry on top, the final innovation report credited me as the lead author of the automation model, while his name appeared in the appendix as a contributor on supporting research. It was a demotion disguised as participation. The aftermath was delicious in its mundanity. Daniel's allies began to scatter, unwilling to attach themselves to someone who couldn't deliver. The junior analyst who had been my quiet partner was promoted to a more visible role. My reputation shifted from the reliable worker in the shadows to the strategist who gets things done. And Daniel, he lingered at the edges of meetings, quieter now, his jokes falling flat, his charisma eroded by the slow drip of lost credibility. It wasn't the explosion he probably feared. It was the slow suffocation of a persona that no longer worked. And here's the part that still makes me smirk. I hadn't destroyed him outright. I had simply built a world where his tricks no longer functioned, where every shortcut was blocked, where every theft turned into a self-exposure. He was left stranded, not by force, but by truth. So I'll ask you this. Would you stop here, satisfied with dismantling someone's reputation piece by piece? Or would you keep going, pushing until there's nothing left of them to salvage? He thought being sidelined in meetings and reduced to a footnote in reports was rock bottom. But the truth. That was just the prelude to his real collapse. After the Innovation Task Force debacle, Daniel was no longer the golden boy or even the silver shadow. He was tolerated, nothing more. His presence in meetings didn't command attention anymore. Managers glanced past him, colleagues avoided partnering with him, and his usual smug banter dried up like a bad punchline. Yet, for a man who had lived on the drug of attention and validation, this silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unbearable. He needed a stage, any stage, and desperation began to warp his judgment. That's when he saw an opening. A senior manager announced an internal competition for a leadership program. The prize. A guaranteed mentorship with the company's executives, plus a fast-track slot for promotion. For Daniel, it was the perfect chance to claw his way back into relevance. He announced, loudly, too loudly, that he was applying, that this was his moment, and even hinted in the break room that the program was practically designed for someone with his natural leadership style. People rolled their eyes, but no one challenged him. That's the thing about arrogance. It sounds convincing until you place it next to evidence. And evidence was the one thing I had in abundance. Here's where my strategy sharpened from defense into full-scale offense. The application process required candidates to submit a portfolio of past achievements, leadership examples, and measurable impact within the company. In other words, it required proof. Normally, Daniel would have cobbled together half-truths, stolen accomplishments, and charisma to smooth the edges. But this time, I was ready to ensure every claim he made unraveled like thread in a cheap suit. Quietly, I began to prepare my own application. Not flashy, just bulletproof. I curated the timeline of my contributions, attached documents, emails, project reports, and client feedback, all neatly labeled and impossible to dispute. Every line had a source. Every claim had a witness. My portfolio wasn't just strong. It was undeniable. Then came the more delicate part, Daniel's submission. He predictably attempted to inflate his role in the client pitch and the innovation project, claiming leadership where he had, in reality, stumbled. He even recycled parts of the very model he'd tried to steal, presenting it as his vision for automation. But remember, I had every draft, every version, every timestamp. I didn't need to sabotage him. All I had to do was let the truth surface in the right places. When the review committee asked candidates to present their portfolios live, I watched him stride to the front with his old swagger. Slide after slide flashed across the screen, filled with half-remembered jargon, vague claims, and borrowed visuals. At one point, he even referenced an automation model I spearheaded, and I had to bite back a smile because I knew exactly what was coming. When it was my turn, I kept it clean, professional, and devastatingly factual. I presented clear metrics: hours saved, cost reductions, client satisfaction scores. I showed screenshots of early drafts with my name, version histories that captured edits in real time, and even emails where Daniel himself had thanked me for filling in the gaps. Each piece was a small nail, and by the end, the coffin was sealed. The room wasn't buzzing, it was quiet, the way a courtroom goes quiet when the verdict becomes obvious. The climax arrived a week later when the results were posted. My name was at the top of the list, selected for the leadership program, chosen for executive mentorship, fast-tracked for promotion. Daniel's name wasn't there at all. Not even as an alternate. I later overheard a manager say his application had raised serious concerns about attribution and integrity. In plain English, his own lies had exposed him. The aftermath was brutal, not because anyone shouted at him, but because no one needed to. The office has a way of turning cold without ever raising its voice. Daniel's emails started going unanswered. His suggestions in meetings were brushed aside with polite nods. His once constant smile flickered, cracked, and eventually disappeared altogether. He looked smaller, like the office itself had shrunk him down to fit his new role, irrelevant background noise. Meanwhile, I was invited to lunches with senior managers, asked for input on projects before they even launched, and given responsibilities he used to covet. The contrast was stark, and everyone saw it. Here's the irony that makes me laugh even now. I never lied, never exaggerated, never sabotaged. I simply documented, prepared, and presented. All I did was shine a light on the truth, and the truth burned him far worse than any rumor or scandal could. His empire had been built on stolen credit and empty charm, and once those were stripped away, there was nothing left for him to stand on. But I'll admit something to you, the victory didn't feel like an ending. Watching him crumble, watching the silence swallow him where applause once followed, I realized I had crossed into a new kind of power. Not the power of revenge for its own sake, but the power of reshaping the rules. He wasn't just punished, he was rewritten. And I was the one holding the pen. So let me throw the question to you. If someone had stolen your work, your credit, and your dignity for years, would you stop after seeing them sidelined? Or would you keep pushing until their very name in the office was synonymous with failure? He thought being erased from promotions, losing credibility, and becoming the butt of whispered jokes was the final act. But for Daniel, the real ending hadn't even begun. By the time my mentorship program was underway, he had become a ghost wandering through the office. He still showed up every morning, still made his coffee, still sat at his desk, but the man who once fed on applause and thrived on stealing credit now survived on scraps of relevance. Colleagues passed him in the hallway with perfunctory nods. His presence in meetings was tolerated but not acknowledged. He wasn't hated. Hatred requires energy. He was worse than that. Forgotten. And for someone like him, invisibility was a punishment crueler than dismissal. But invisibility can breed danger. When people are cornered, when they feel their power slipping through their fingers, they often attempt one last desperate move. Daniel's came in the form of a rumor. Quietly, he began to whisper that my meteoric rise wasn't about talent or hard work, but about manipulation. He suggested, subtly at first, then more openly, that I had friends in the right places, and that my success was less about results and more about politics. He wanted to sow doubt, to poison the well of trust one had built. And if this were any other time, maybe it would have worked. Offices love gossip the way fire loves oxygen. But here's the thing, while he was whispering shadows, I was building walls of light. Every deliverable I touched during the mentorship program was over-documented, cross-signed, and publicly acknowledged. I didn't just complete projects. I made sure results were visible, repeatable, and verifiable by anyone in the company. My mentors saw numbers, client feedback, and measurable impact. Rumors, no matter how poisonous, can't stand against receipts. And yet, I didn't ignore his attempt. I leaned into it. If he wanted to accuse me of playing politics, I would show the entire company what it looked like when politics met competence. That opportunity came during the company-wide summit, an annual event where each department presented its biggest achievements of the year. Normally, Daniel would have thrived in such a spotlight. But this year, I was the one tasked with presenting our department's success story. The automation model, the client pitch, the innovation reforms. Daniel, ironically, had nothing on the agenda with his name attached. He still attended, of course, hovering near the back, arms folded, eyes narrowed. I could almost hear the bitterness vibrating in his silence. When my turn came, I didn't give a flashy speech. I didn't even mention him by name. I simply walked the audience, executives, clients, colleagues, through a year of undeniable results. Cost savings, efficiency gains, client wins, promotion of junior staff who had once been sidelined by credit thieves. Each slide was a quiet hammer, pounding a nail into the coffin of doubt. And then, with almost surgical calm, I ended with a comparison. Metrics from before these reforms and metrics after. The difference was so stark it needed no embellishment. It was irrefutable proof of transformation. When the applause came, it wasn't loud in a theatrical way. It was steady, professional, and long. The kind of applause that means trust has been earned. Climax arrived in the most mundane way possible. A week later, Daniel was invited to a performance review. I don't know exactly what was said behind those closed doors, but I do know what happened after. His role was restructured. He was quietly moved to a less visible position in another department, one that carried the same title but none of the influence. It was the corporate equivalent of exile. No one celebrated, no one cheered. People just shrugged, as if he had already ceased to exist long before the paperwork caught up. And here's the delicious irony. I never needed to scream, to sabotage, or to lie. His downfall was self-authored. All I did was hold up a mirror made of receipts, and the reflection destroyed him. He wanted to be remembered as a leader, a visionary, a star. Instead, he became a cautionary tale whispered over coffee. The guy who flew too high on stolen wings and plummeted when the wind of truth blew them away. The finale for me was subtle but profound. I didn't just win promotions or applause. I won something deeper. I proved, to myself most of all, that patience, strategy, and truth could be sharper than revenge delivered in anger. I didn't just dismantle him. I rewrote the story of how credit flows in our department. Now, junior analysts speak up more, managers ask who contributed at each step, and the culture has shifted from rewarding charisma to rewarding substance. My victory wasn't just personal. It was systemic. And that, more than his exile, was the sweetest triumph of all. Still, sometimes, when I pass the old department and catch a glimpse of him at his new desk, smaller, grayer, quieter, I wonder if he realizes that every step of his downfall was a consequence of his own greed colliding with my preparation. I don't gloat. Not anymore. The satisfaction has settled into something calmer, like justice, like balance. But deep down, I know one thing. If he ever tries to claw back what he once stole, I'll be ready. Because now, the rules of the game belong to me. So tell me, would you have gone this far? Would you have let him fade quietly into irrelevance? Or would you have delivered one final blow to erase him completely? Which ending feels more like justice to you?